Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome to the Nikolaus Cox Part 2, Amazonian Arcana, the conclusion of the conversation that we had with Nikolaus a few months back. This was pulled from our Patreon archive, the Patreon dungeon, if you will, the booze-soaked dungeon over at patreon.com/Cryptonaut podcast. We had such a great response to the first episode going out that we are super excited to be putting Part 2 out here. It's always a great time talking with Nikolaus. He's such a great dude. He's got so many awesome adventures, and things get a little bit weird this episode. It's super creepy, so strap in for that. Be sure to be on the lookout for Nikolaus's own podcast, the Mastorians podcast. This is going to be launching soon. In the description of this episode, we will have a link to the official Instagram account for that show. So if you're on the Instas, be sure to follow that account and be on the lookout for when that episode will drop. It will be happening soon. On to other news very quickly here. This weekend, Saturday, April 24th at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the boys and I will be on the Discord for our first official movie night beta run. We're going to be on there watching a movie with the good Patreon folks. That's available to the $1 and $5 tier. This is a beta run. We're just going to test it out, see if there's something that maybe we can do more of in the future. So be sure to join us. And again, that is this Saturday, April 24th, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That information will be on the socials, I am sure. So without further ado, Christopher Q. That creepy music. Welcome to the Cryptonaut Podcast, Patreon edition. I am Mark Storrs. With me, as always, is
Rob Morphy.
And we are joined here for a part 2 with Mr. Nikolaus Cox. We are talking about the Amazonian Arcana.
I love it. I love Arcana. We started with the Andean Arcana, and he gave us a slice of what Bolivian life was like, especially the way Catholicism meets the deeper, more pre-Columbian mystical arts and practices. And so, without further ado, let's bring back Nikolaus Cox, who is just an astonishing human being, a raconteur, a global traveler, a gonzo journalist, an archaeologist, Cambridge educated, hailing from New Zealand, going all the way to Britain and coming to you direct through us to tell us more stories of the crazy, mystical, occult side of South America that he has experienced firsthand. And so without further ado, Nick, care to bring us back into this journey of yours?
Hello, friends. It is I, Nikolaus Cox, your erstwhile guide, taking you from the Andes to the Amazon. Brilliant.
Yes! I love it. You did it.
So,
you did.
So good. Oh, my God. So we're right back at it. We've already discussed Andean Arcana. So that's up in the mountains that... The mountain range that bisects South America. Well, actually,
yeah, we got the cliff of treachery and witchcraft. We
exactly.
got the conflation of indigenous beliefs with Roman Catholicism that dissipates more and more until it's almost completely absent on the fringes of Bolivia, where things get really interesting.
Which is where we're going.
Yes, we're getting super deep next. The uncle, the Dark Lord of the Caves, and of course, the cursed pizza maker. No, the cursed proprietor of a building that eventually became a pizzeria, wherein the residue influenced everything, including a horrible night Nick had with a buddy of his, KK. And now we're going to go even deeper with Nick. And Nick, again, thank you so much. The conversation's been fun so far, and I can't wait to see where we're going next.
Me neither. This is so exciting. So yes, as you say, we've kind of given the background to the fact that Bolivia is quite a unique country in that local beliefs and religions, and by local I mean sort of the old religions that predate colonialism, still very much hold sway. We've discussed the witchcraft of even the more urban centers. We have described the sort of synthesis between Catholicism and local belief. And we have, of course, discussed spooky pizza and devil worship in the mines. But now we're about to go to the real peripheries of Bolivia. Because we're now going to go into the Amazon rainforest, which had been a dream of mine since childhood to enter. And luckily, working as a journalist for a magazine where really you could write anything so long as it raised the profile of Bolivia and wasn't too critical of their totalitarian government, you could write whatever you liked, really. And I was able to pitch an article where I said, hey, how about I go to the Amazon to write an article about river dolphins?
The
and
best.
They said, yeah, that's
brilliant.
fine.
Ever since I saw them on Jacques Cousteau when I was a kid, I was like, this is real. Oh, this is fucking amazing. Those adorable, and they're swimming in pure filth, and they're utter poetry.
The water looks like chocolate milk. It is as warm as a hot bath, and it is full of big, fat, pink dolphins, and that is the headwaters of the Amazon River. And yeah, so I sort of pitched my magazine. I said, hey, could I go out here and do this piece? And they said, yeah, if you want to risk the flight to Rurrenabaque, which is the regional capital of the Departamento del Beni, which is the Beni region, in which lies Parque Madidi, which is where I thought I was going to find river dolphins. And Madidi is interesting to mention because you've actually mentioned in previous podcasts.
Very recently.
And if you want to give a little bit of background to the Madidi as you understand it.
Well, as I understand it, and it is obviously much more limited as I've never been there, but what I have been fascinated by for years, decades really, the better part of my life, is the lore of, I guess, bizarrely like Ghidorah-like dragons, like be it the three-headed one that was like the first thing that really broke the news cycle, but more importantly, the dinosaur-like / weird aquatic mammal-like giant creatures that have been, at least the legends of, that have been surfacing from that area for years and years. And so as I know that place, it is like a lost world. Like literally you expect Dr. Challenger to come, rummaging out of the jungle at any time and be like, look what I found. It's awesome. But you're exploring. No, please go ahead.
So I was just going to sort of add to that by sort of saying, I think you actually mentioned that Percy Fawcett was one such adventurer, explorer, researcher, archaeologist, military man who encountered these cryptids. And Percy Fawcett is in many ways a personal hero of mine because he was an archaeologist who really challenged the status quo in the early 1900s and searched for the lost city of Zed, or Z, if you're on the other side of the Atlantic. And he didn't do it in the conquistadorial style of looking for a city of gold, but he earnestly believed that there were civilizations capable, or previous civilizations in the Amazon that had been capable of building societies that were considered by Western ideology at the time impossible. The idea was that no one before Columbus came could possibly have built cities of this magnitude in the jungle, but Percy disagreed with that and ultimately lost his life in the Madidi Basin, the same area that he encountered these cryptids you've described. And he was a man that had always inspired me as a child, and it was very much to sort of go where Percy had been as a aspiring archaeologist and a journalist that led me on my expedition to look for river dolphins in the Madidi Basin. As it turned out, I was actually incorrect. The Madidi does not have river dolphins. So river dolphins live mainly in the Pampas, which is flat plain land interspersed with myriad waterways, whereas the Madidi is less frequent waterways and big jagged mountains covered in jungle. And so I booked myself in this week spent in the interior of the Madidi, where I hoped I was going to find river dolphins, only to be told that there weren't going to be any there. So I had to do a quick pivot. Once I arrived at the regional capital of Departamento del Beni, which is Rurrenabaque, when I arrived in the Youre, I was sort of thinking to myself, okay, so I'm not going to see any dolphins for the next week, which is why I'm here. What do I do? And I spoke to the tour company, and they said, well, we can put you up in the residence of a local Takana man, and you can just live with the Takana population for a week or more.
I love that.
That's pretty
I
awesome.
know what I like. All great adventurers, you turn the loss into a win. And instead of kicking the dirt and cursing your fate and be like, fuck, where's my dolphins? You were like, oh, wait. Let's find out about the great Takana people. Let's learn their folklore, their lifestyle. I love the fact, to me, and I'm a guy much like you, that whatever world traveling I've done has been by the seat of my pants and ill prepared.
I never planned ahead.
Never know what you're going to run into. But then when you get there, you exploit. That's probably the ugly term. I shouldn't say it like that, but I mean that in the sense that you take the opportunities that are there and you run them for all they're worth, because fuck it, you have one idea and that's not it. Well, what are you going to do? Stop everything? I love that about what you did, Nick. You instantly just pivoted, like you say, and made it about something else that led you down a really fascinating path.
Well, exactly. I had some incredible experiences. I think that some of the best, and people might disagree with me, but some of the best holidays can be had by planning to go to a place with an open mind and no prior preparation. I think no prior preparation and being closed-minded will lead to a bad experience. But if you enter if you go to a place and you say, I haven't done any reading on here, but I'm open to experience anything. And next thing you know, you're in a motorized canoe leaving the local capital with a man called Nilo, who is taking you deep into the headwaters of the Amazon rainforest to live with him and his family in their sort of riverside settlement. And that was done entirely spontaneously because I was meant to go to a quite glamorous lodge and look at dolphins, but I completely got my lines crossed, and now I was living in the jungle with the Takana people for a week. But I decided I was going to write a piece on the way the Takana view the world and also the lifeways, myths and legends and perspectives the Takana have of the jungle, which led me ultimately to the conversations that will form the basis of what we will be discussing on this episode.
That's amazing.
Awesome. Yeah, that's dope.
It really is. It is the way to do it. You make the most of it. So you meet Nilo. Can you tell us a little bit about Nilo?
So Nilo is a Takana man. Now, the Takana is a small population of people who live in the Madidi Basin, mainly within the boundaries of what is now the national park of Parque Madidi, but they live elsewhere too. I mean, the parks are not bounded by fences or walls. It's just a declared space of protection. But the jungle is vast. Something people don't really take into account is that the Amazon rainforest is absolutely boundless. When you're flying in the terrifying flight from La Paz to Rurrenabaque, you fly over a small mountain range, well, one of the highest mountain ranges in the world, but it's smaller by comparison to the Andes. And then suddenly you just have this green expanse open up before you as far as the eye can see, and that is the Amazon jungle. And within this live numerous different indigenous populations, including the Takana people, who I think number about 30,000. It's a small population of people. And Nilo, he's not sure how old he is because years move differently in the Amazon.
Oh, I love that. I love the idea that you know the way you put it, and I'm going to be paraphrasing here because I don't have it in front of me, but like, he's going to tell a story at some point that you will probably relate, that happened 15 years after his umbilical cord was severed, which is a beautiful way of saying your birth. And that after that, he estimated that he was probably 30 something years, but you're not enslaved. I mean, yes, you know seasons, you know the rhythms of nature. And that's something also I would love for you to discuss a little bit, just the idea of the Takana people, probably a lot of the indigenous peoples, but the Takana people in specific, and the way they relate to their environment as a real live teeming jungle full of flora and fauna, but also as a spiritual and sort of conscious place. And the idea that these people live day to day with their deities and their beliefs and their environment, and they're not necessarily like we are. I mean, we're enslaved in Western culture to the minute. These people aren't even enslaved to years, and I can't help but to find that enviable. At the very least.
You're absolutely right. So the story about him being 15 years from losing his umbilical cord, that was the first time he encountered foreigners. When Nilo was born, the Takana was still a nomadic group. They would travel through the rainforest. And he remembers when he was 15 years on from losing his umbilical cord, a group of white travelers appeared who were hoping to experience the jungle and experience life and living with the Takana. And he remembers this encounter with these people, the first time he'd ever seen someone who wasn't a Takana, because they paid with cash for the privilege of enjoying their experience. And so they handed all this paper money to Nilo's parents, and Nilo remembers that his family took these sheets of paper with people's faces on it and put it straight into the fire because they assumed they were being given kindling, because the idea of money didn't exist for
How
the Takana.
beautiful is that, though? How beautiful is that?
Seriously.
It's honest. It is beautiful. And there have been some changes in their society since then. When the Bolivian government established the national parks, they could no longer have nomadic people roaming freely. So they insisted that the Takana must become sedentary, but they were to be granted gigantic tracts of land that would serve as their permanent property. So Nilo's small family unit, which is his brother, his niece, his mother, and a few other people, they have a patch of property so large it took us 6 hours to walk across it. It goes from a river through a jungle and up a mountain. That is just his family's tract of land.
Wow.
However, Nilo... Sorry.
No, I was just saying that's both extraordinary in one sense and also... it's just like a bizarre redefinition of a reservation, It
is, isn't it? Yeah.
You're still limiting, as expansive as it is, you're still physically limiting them.
And
that's neither here nor there. It just made me think good, but fuck.
Exactly. Like their traditional life way is still being limited. And I'm sure if more people found value in the rainforest as a place to live, they would have less property. But most people don't want to live in the jungle. And thus the jungle is sort of given over in these gigantic, as you say, reservations to the Takana people. But Nilo also cannot avoid anymore the imposition of the modern world. He has a cell phone, and once a week he climbs to the top of a hill 6 hours away to have coverage. And he gets phone calls from Ruranabake, the only village really, with a cell phone tower for miles around. And they'll tell him if there are tourists who are going to stay at his place. And he actually, now the government has kind of forced him to have a need for money now. But despite that, despite the now modern imposition that creates a need for currency and a need for a cell phone and forbids you from being nomadic, a great deal of their traditional ways still persists. And this is present in the fact that in Takana to Takana interactions, they don't use money. They use trade of skills, trade of favor, or trade of items. And similarly, their religious and cultural understanding or social understanding of the jungle remains unadulterated despite the impositions of the modern world. And that's what you're getting to, because for the Takana, Nilo knows more about every tree in that jungle than I could ever know about one. He took me on a tour, and every single tree, I was able to point to it and tell me every single tree's purpose and how it serves jungle living. Nilo knew more than any of us could possibly learn about one tree, and he knew about the entire jungle. Because for the Takana, even though he does have contact with the outside world latently, for the Takana people, they're making the willing choice to remain a jungle-dwelling people. And as such, their entire universe is the rainforest. Like our entire, for people who live in sort of the global north in places like Britain and America, like you and I, sort of the planet is our world. But for the Takana, they're quite happy for the Amazon to be the extent of their planet. And as such, they understand it as an entire universe, a universe that is both scientific but also esoteric. And I think we've discussed this before a few times, you guys and myself, but in the global north, we consider certain things to be esoteric, supernatural, preternatural, inexplicable, and then other things to be justified by rational science. And we have a very black and white distinction between things that make sense and things that don't. And one is taken as real and the other is laughable. But
you're absolutely right.
For the Takana people, they don't have the history that informs our culture. And as such, Nilo describes things with a very scientific mind. In the same breath, he'll describe something that is entirely, to our perspective, supernatural, esoteric, or magical. But Nilo doesn't create the distinction between talking about something that would say, well, that's occultism, and something that would say, well, that's hard science. Nilo understands the scientific nature of his rainforest, but for him, the rainforest is more than just a scientific thing. It is also a living, breathing, spiritual organism, the entire thing, and thus it must be observed in a spiritual sense simultaneously.
If I may, Nick
Yes.
and Mark, I'm going to dip back into the paper you wrote on this, which again, as I mentioned in the last episode, will be made available to all of our listeners. And as much as I was enthralled by the first part of what you said regarding a higher science, this is just going to further nail down what you're saying in your own words. But I think our audience really deserves to hear this because it's really rendered in a brilliant way. And I quote, "Rational science, following the breakthroughs of the European Enlightenment, has done wonders for making sense of the world around us and enabling us to harness its powers for the betterment and often the detriment, too, of humanity. But there is still much we do not understand or cannot explain, and in our arrogance decry it as, quote, pseudoscience and folklore. People seem revolted by the idea that there are things in this world which could be considered a quote-unquote higher science." Again, a phrase I'm going to give you fucking full credit for as far as I'm concerned. It's an astonishing way to look at the unknown. It's still science. It might just not be a science we've wrapped our heads around. So, to get back to this, considered a higher science, that which we cannot explain yet and which we will one day evolve to be able to comprehend. Instead, there is, quote, fact and, quote, fiction in two distinct black and white camps. And I love the way you posit that, really, about the society that we all live in, Mark, I, Chris, you, and many of our listeners live in, and that it is or it isn't. But this world that the Takana live in, and many other people of the world, be they Native American, on and on, I could literally go forever. You don't have this basically arbitrary line between what is just the hardcore accepted Newtonian physics, and I say that, in reference to all elements of science of the world, and this more, metaphysical makes it sound like fucking loopy-doopy, but like this element that is something you engage with in a different way, where there is a consciousness in the environment and a deeper reality. And I love that Nilo and his family and his tribe, and then the broader Takana people, and many, many others engage in this way that is antithetical to what we think, but just because we think it, and I've fallen into the arrogance of fucking, the Western world as much as anybody else, but I'm not so high-handed as to think that it is the only way to think, that there is a broader way in which we can perceive the world we live in that is actually more practical in a lot of ways, because it is something that is mysterious and expansive and ethereal in a lot of ways, and cannot be reduced always to simple numbers. And so I know I just digressed a hell of a lot, but I wanted to give you full credit for what you just said there specifically. And again, our listeners will be able to find this online and read the whole thing themselves. This idea of a higher science and a way to it's to me it's the rational metaphysical. It is something that we need to be able to do as a people, to say that we don't get it yet, but that doesn't mean it's bullshit or something slapdash. Some of it is based on not just higher principles, but more entrenched, ancient, well-known, true principles of how we should relate to our world than a lot of the seemingly arbitrary rules we follow to this day.
Oh, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And the fascinating thing is that we assume there is a division because our culture has created an environment in which we insist that there must be a division.
Right.
But then the Takana, who have their entire culture has developed, evolved, and become what it is in relative isolation, almost complete isolation to the rest of the world. Like I said, I mean, Nilo's culture was still nomadic when he was a child. He was 15 years old, or 15 years on from losing his umbilical cord, when he first encounters a foreigner. And at that point, money was still completely novel to them. Like their culture had lived almost up until this generation in complete isolation. And in doing so, they have a completely different perspective on the world. That their perspective is one where things that are scientific and things that are parapsychological are one and the same. There is not a distinction. It is just a way to understand the jungle. And it's amazing that we have to find ways to sort of describe that to ourselves now, because we're so hardwired to assume there's a difference. But it's only because our culture makes us think there's a difference.
It demands that we observe the difference. And in fact, all of us that are interested in the Fortean, all three of us and everyone listening ostensibly, have been forced to kind of negotiate this sort of rough terrain or unchartable waters of it, when in reality, the people that likely have just a more in tune method of looking at the world, because they get it from their ancestors, they get it from a practical point of view. They're not looking at it this way because they've been taught it's one or the other. They're looking at it this way because this is how you survive it. This is how you function within it, because it embodies both, as you said, the scientific and the paraphysical and parapsychological. And it's funny, all of us have been trying so hard to negotiate these waters, but it's almost like an arbitrary impediment that has been forced onto us by the educational system and the world in which we were born. And it doesn't necessarily have to exist. And people like the Takana prove, and others, that some people do not have this, what I consider a very real limitation on their ability to perceive the quote unquote real world.
You're absolutely right.
Definitely.
It's fascinating. It truly is. It's entirely perception based. And a big part of the Takana perception of the jungle, which, as we've established, is this beautiful synthesis without apology and without a line drawn between the metaphysical and the scientific, a big part of it is their belief in the deity Pachamama, who I alluded to in the last episode, but we haven't really talked about. I've been saving her for now. So Pachamama,
the earth goddess, right?
The earth goddess, exactly. She is the Inca. She is the Andean goddess of nature. So she is Gaia. She is Mother Earth. She was worshipped by the Inca. She was worshipped by the Tiwanacotta before the Inca. She's been worshipped as far back as we can find carvings and records that this entity known as Pachamama has been worshipped. And as we've been discussing earlier, the further away from the urban centers in Bolivia that you get, the stronger belief in indigenous religion becomes. And Pachamama, by the time you reach the rainforest, is a very all-powerful entity. And the way Nilo described the jungle to me is effectively the jungle is Pachamama. And every tree and creature in the jungle is first permitted by Pachamama to exist within the jungle, and also infused with her spirit. And because of this, like, there are some very strict rules, like you never hunt for sport in the jungle, because that's just killing Pachamama and Pachamama's emissaries for no better reason than enjoyment, and that is against the rules. And
shouldn't that be a foundational human rule? Period.
Absolutely.
Sport hunting can go suck itself to death. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, it's pretty fucking horrible.
It's absolutely disgusting, yeah. And so the Takana have these very clear rules, because for them, the jungle, and this is the other fascinating thing, which you see in certain religions, is the idea that their goddess, Pachamama, much like the Greek gods, is sort of capable of being avaricious, cruel, capricious. She can do as much damage as she can do good, because much like earlier gods and earlier mythologies, Pachamama represents a natural element. She represents the rainforest, and the rainforest is not always good to the people that live in it. Although the rainforest can be bountiful, full of food and fruit and animals, and the rivers can be full of fish, those rivers can flood. The animals can attack and kill you. There is so much in the jungle that can kill kill a person as much as the jungle can provide for a person. And the Turkana have explained this by basically saying Pachamama, much like a regular human being, is capable of having different moods and different behaviors. So while they worship and adore Pachamama because she gives them permission to live their lease under her trees and gives them food and gives them wood and palm fronds with which they can make their abodes, she can also kill them with snakes, scorpions, floods, droughts. So Pachamama is this entity that represents all the moods and the seasons of the jungle combined into a single spiritual being.
What I love about this, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Nick, but this humanistic way of looking at a deity is that, you know, those, again, in the Western world of the Abrahamic religions have been taught since a time immemorial. You know, Chris, who is not here right now, but we were raised in Roman Catholic environment. We went to parochial school and the whole 9 yards, where we were just indoctrinated over and over. And the whole and the statement that is made over and over again is that we were created, quote unquote, in God's image. Yet the version of God that they expound upon, this universally merciful and omnipotent and above any emotional attachment except for just pure glory and love, but never wrath, except, you know, when he drowned the world, but that was way back in the day.
That's
and,
Old
and
Testament.
all that stuff. You know, it's like if we're made in his image, then he didn't do a very good job because we are nothing like that. But the idea of Pachamama just being this thing that, like you say, can be capricious and jealous and vindictive and whatever the fuck else we feel, but also is capable of great mercy and affection and love. And I assume very, in a sense, motherly to the people of Amazonia. And I love that because it seems more authentic in a lot of ways.
Well, it makes sense. Totally. I mean, all religions like to say that they were made in the image of their gods, but if you look at what humans are like these days, you're like, well, we must be made in the image of equally flawed gods. And some religions, such as the Greeks, openly, and the Chicana too, openly say, yeah, our gods are a flawed bunch of bastards, but that's because we're just like them, and that's how it makes sense. And I think it's very, I think it's incorrect to sort of say, oh, you know, a god could be all loving and all the rest of it when we're made in the image of that God and we are not those things. And that's what the Turkana recognize perfectly willingly. And that is the rules that inform their day-to-day through till today.
Nice.
That makes sense. And that way you show a genuine affection and deference, but also a fear, because it's almost like a relationship of a child to a parent. I think a lot of the initial incarnations of religion was very much like that. Like, you're loved, and parents can run the gamut of like being very affectionate, but, you know, everyone has an off day, to very stern or even abusive. But gods can also run that gamut, and you relate to them like that. Like, you will love them and you need them and they created you, but it doesn't mean that they aren't capable of having flaws or temper tantrums or whatever. And if you happen to have godlike powers, that results in floods and earthquakes and fucking volcanic eruptions and whatnot. And I get that. I get, at least fundamentally, that relationship. And I can see how the Turkana and others would have that with Pachamama.
Exactly. And I feel personally makes Pachamama a far more approachable and understandable god. But also it explains the stories that Nilo has told me about the darker side of Pachamama, or at least the darker side of the rainforest, which in Nilo's perspective is Pachamama.
Because I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but where we're about to go now, and the dark side of Pachamama, as you say, are accounts, two of which you got from Nilo, eyewitness firsthand accounts, secondhand to you, and then eventually we're going to get into a firsthand thing. But let's set the scene wherein you and Nilo were settling down, and he decided to share with you, an academic and also at this point a friend, some of the experiences he had, Nick.
Yeah, so it was late one evening. It was impossible to tell what time because the sun sets very quickly in the Amazon and everything goes pitch black almost immediately. But I had helped Nilo and his brother catch a bunch of fish in the river just down from where their clearing was, where they had their sort of tarpaulins and thatched houses set up that gave us shelter. And we'd caught a bunch of fish. We'd caught 7 fish. We kept all of them alive in a net underwater. That's 7 fish. That's 1 fish for each day. His people are subsistence farmers and hunter-gatherers. And then feeling quite pleased with ourselves, and, we've got that camaraderie of, we all went hunting together. We all sat under the tarpaulin and we just got chatting. We're talking about the jungle. And Nilo had earlier mentioned that he had had 3 scary experiences in the jungle in his lifetime. 3 things that had happened to him, and he prayed they'd never happen again. And now that we're sitting down and it was pitch black outside, we had our torches and our lanterns, and we started sharing these stories. And Nilo started to tell me, and he sort of looked at me and he said, I've had 3 terrifying experiences in my life, and I pray to God I'll never have a 4th. And he said, because Pachamama can give these. This is not what he was saying, but this is like the implication is that Pachamama can give everything that is good, but she can give everything that is bad too. And bad things have happened to him when he has upset Pachamama. And all these stories take place in what Nilo refers to as El Corazón del Bosque, which means the heart of the jungle. And there are there's no one place in the Amazon that is the heart of the jungle. The heart of the jungle is parts of the rainforest that have never been inhabited by humans, not even by indigenous people. So the Arcana don't live there. To their knowledge, no one has ever lived there beforehand. These are just parts of the rainforest where no one has ever existed.
So there are multiple pockets, right? I apologize for interrupting you. Multiple pockets wherein the indigenous people around them do not tread. They are deeper, they are darker. Of course, I can't help but think of the heart of darkness and get, into my Apocalypse Now face. But really, that's a Western perspective on a very deep and primal indigenous idea of a place where, people just don't go.
Yes, they're just regions where people have never been. And the world is full of places like this. And often they are particularly inaccessible due to their geography. But for the Arcana, they believe there are certain parts of the rainforest that aren't actually too hard to get into. But you basically know to never go there because there are parts of the rainforest where Pachamama does not inhabit the trees and the animals with her spirits, but she and her entourage of spiritual deities, these sort of supernatural beings, don't inhabit other creatures, but they walk abroad. This is a land where the mortal world is not meant to enter. This is a land exclusively for the supernatural. And there are these well understood boundaries within a boundless jungle where the Arcana do not go. And I believe other indigenous groups have the same thing. There are parts of the rainforest where you just know no one's ever been and no one is meant to go there. No one's ever been there for a good reason. But of course,
it's
white foreigners don't know that.
Right, of course not. But this is a place where the divine are unencumbered. They don't wear the skin of the flora and fauna. They aren't communing with a barrier. Sort of like, if you want to go back to Abrahamic things, Yahweh using a burning bush to talk to Moses. Some corporeal thing that it might be mystical and weird, but at least you can wrap your mind around it and talk to a burning bush. Where Pachamama might be, some sort of animal or, a tree covered in vines or whatever she might be. In this place, her, and like you say, her entourage, I assume other divine, or if not divine, at least ethereal entities that walk
sort
with
of her
or
ministers.
just below her.
They're all part of her, but they're her ministers. They represent her and they work for her. Yeah. An entourage.
But they
exactly,
function without, again, the encumbrance of false flesh or bark or stem. They are just raw in their ethereal form.
You're absolutely right. So not far, a few hours from where Nilo lives, is this giant tree called the Mapaho Tree. And Nilo told me that across the jungle, you get these Mapaho trees. They're giant, like their trunks extend above the general canopy. They're absolutely massive, impossibly large trees, and they're very rare, but where they do appear, they're absolutely domineering the view. And what Nilo explained to me is that the Mapaho tree is the king of the forest, in that these are sacred spaces where Pachamama's essence is inside these trees, and these are places where Nilo and his family, his tribe, and the Arcana people will hold annual ceremonies and worship below the Mapaho Tree, because this is the physical manifestation of Pachamama, but she is still wearing the guise of a tree. Whereas in the heart of the jungle, Pachamama, and I think often of that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Nazis open the Ark of the Covenant and they look upon the face of the divine and they all melt. And,
yes. Yeah, no, you're right.
Best scene ever.
It's a fantastic scene. And it's a very similar thing here, where sort of Indiana Jones and Marion have to close their eyes in order to also not melt. It's not like it targets the good or the bad. It's just the raw power of the divine will kill a mortal. That's the message from that scene in Indiana Jones. And it's very much the same thing out here. Like when Pachamama is infusing a Mapaho tree, it's a little safer, not entirely safe, but it's a little safer than walking into her domain where she and her ministers are completely unencumbered by corporeal form. They are just there in their absolute essence. And were a Takana to enter this land, they would go much the way of the Nazis and Indiana Jones.
Your face is a candlestick.
Well, basically, yeah.
So
Melty McMelterton.
But as I alluded earlier, Nilo can't deny the necessity for money. The need to have money has now been forced upon his people, and he now has to earn money and have a job. And he was my guide. He was the man that provided me with a roof over my head during my time in the jungle. And for a price, he will take white, well, not necessarily white, but, he will take foreigners, explorers, adventurers, researchers into the rainforest, and he'll take them in his canoe, and he'll take them overland, wherever they really need to go, because Nilo's a bushman. He knows the jungle better than almost anyone else, better than anyone I've ever met, that's for sure. And on 3 separate occasions, Nilo, because he was paid handsomely, agreed to take foreign expeditions. I don't know. One group were botanists. Another group were bird scientists. But I don't know if the third group were adventurers or scientists themselves. But on 3 separate occasions, he has taken groups of people into El Corazon del Bosque and met with haunting results. And I think that now sets up the stories to now tell.
Yes, it does. And that's fascinating. So again, you and Nilo, it was, it's classic. It's a classic, like not necessarily dark and stormy night, but it's dark. You guys have forged a bond, granted in the limited time you had, and he knows you're genuinely, as an academic and just a curious human being, intrigued by these things and recognizing the sincere interest on your part. And this is what I gleaned from your writing. He decides that he's going to open up and tell you a series of 3 experiences. I think I got it wrong earlier and said 2 that he had. And so let's get into the first, basically eyewitness account that he had that was stirring when he went beyond the boundaries that mortals are supposed to go in the heart of Amazonia into basically the guts where Pachamama and her acolytes exist.
Exactly. So the first encounter, he told, was he and this team of people. And the other important thing is these 3 stories happen chronologically. So this happened first. They're not all necessarily the same expedition, but they happened one after the other chronologically. And also each time these stories occurred, they were deeper into unexplored regions than the previous story. So you'll notice these stories ramp up in intensity. But also this is corresponding with the fact they're geographically getting further and further into land that is Pachamama's alone.
Right. So the deeper you go into the bowels, in a sense, the more dramatic or even perhaps potentially dangerous the experiences become.
Exactly. So it's really, the further in you get, the worse it will get. So the first story is that Nilo and a team of ornithologists were now 25 days from where he and I were having this conversation. They were a week away from the nearest indigenous settlement. So they were a week into, or maybe into unexplored territory.
Let me just ask you this, Nick.
Yes.
And not that I expect you to have like specific numbers, but what does 25 days or a week mean in terms, generally speaking, of distance?
It's difficult to say because Nilo and his people travel mainly by boat on the rivers. But to get into the Corazon del Bosque, you're normally going overland. So it took us 6 hours to walk a very small distance in his family's property because it's,
Right.
I mean, the climate, the temperature. So 25 days does not necessarily mean the other side of the Amazon. It could be closer than you think. It's just, if you're going overland, the going will be very slow. This is choking jungle.
Right.
So it's but again, the other thing is like Nilo is giving me these are Nilo's estimates. He can tell me it was 25 days from where we are now. It was 7 days from the nearest settlement. He can tell me in days, but he can't tell me in distance.
Deeply subjective.
Exactly. Yes.
Right. That's good enough. That's all. I just wanted to get because I'm trying to wrap my head around it because when you say 25 days, and I mean, I know it's not a car. I know it's not easy going. I know it's not flat plains. I know it's treacherous, dense, ridiculously obstacle covered terrain. But I'm just trying to frame it in my head a little bit.
So Nilo and his companions had come into this valley with an unnamed river in an unnamed part of Amazonia. And Nilo told me he felt apprehensive this evening. The jungle often feels silent and seems to be empty when you're walking through it, but you always know there are thousands of creatures within 10 feet of you watching you. But on this particular night or evening, there was something that made Nilo's hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He didn't like how he was being watched. And he produced his necklace of caiman teeth and peccary tusks and put it around his neck. And then put into the hollow of the caiman tooth a mix of coca leaves, yahua, which is a spicy Bolivian salsa, and some crushed up cigarettes because, as he's told me before, this protects you from spirits because the spiky teeth around your neck mean a spirit can't throttle you. And this foul-smelling mix makes you smell so bad it deters a spirit from wanting to interfere with you. It's an interesting ward, and this will actually become more relevant when we get to later stories. But he's wearing this necklace. He's put his foul-smelling mix into the hollow tooth, and he went down to the river to wash his hands. There was no one else around him when he felt his skin prickle, and he realized he was being watched. And he looked up, and he saw a distant figure in profile emerge from the forest edge on the opposing bank of the river and begin to walk along the beach. And this looked to be an indigenous man who was unusually tall and powerfully built. He didn't look like the indigenous men Nilo was used to, but more like how they know the indigenous men were of a pre-colonial period, who was wearing nothing.
Which means what exactly?
It means he looked to be a man who didn't have any Spanish blood in him. He looked to be sort of as ethnically indigenous as is possible, which is very rare in colonial countries because the blood of the colonists, and there's always going to be genetic mixing. So it's very rare to actually come across someone who is completely untouched by colonial influence, especially by the time we reach, the modern world when colonization happened 500 years ago. But this man looked to be, in his style of dress, because he was also wearing nothing but an animal hide loincloth. He was dressed and appeared to be someone of a pre-colonial period. He did not appear to see Nilo, and walked diagonally towards him. Now, diagonally becomes relevant in a slow and confident manner. It was a rather curious way he was approaching Nilo because he was approaching him showing only half his body in profile. As he got to the edge of the river, he became a little bit clearer, and Nilo could see that he had long black hair and a crooked nose. But Nilo was confused because he knew of no other groups traversing this part of the jungle, and there were no local groups who were meant to live in this jungle. So who could this man be? And then the man reached the water's edge and Nilo's skin went cold because this man's feet made no splash or ripple as they hit the surface of the river. For Nilo, it seemed as if this man glided over the water, or else the water was less than an inch deep. But Nilo knew for a fact that the water was over his head at the center of the river. But even now, as the man crossed what should have been the deepest part, he didn't seem to sink at all. And then he reached the opposing beach, which is where Nilo was washing his hands. And as Nilo watched in stupefied silence, the man, still walking at this diagonal, showing only half his side, crossed the beach, striding with purpose and confidence, and vanished back into the forest close to where Nilo sat. And that was the first encounter Nilo had with something he considers inexplicable. He tells me, as we're sitting in the dark, he says he thinks this was a warning, a messenger telling me to not go any deeper into this part of the forest.
It's interesting. So he sees this pre-colonial indigenous figure who I think was very tall, powerfully built, like you say, just something that, is an impressive figure. I agree what you say. Diagonal is subjective, but shows up only in profile, and more significantly in this case, does not, he's pulling a Christ. He's walking across water that he has no business being able to walk across.
And it's interesting to mention that when Nilo got his confidence back and walked a bit further down the beach, he found no tracks in the sand where the man ought to have been walking. So it was as if the man had not physically been there. But Nilo had seen this man emerge from the trees and cross the river. And Nilo says that he thinks this may very well have been a warning to not go any further in. Because again, and I think this is important to stress, is like, while it may not look like it to an outside observer, for Nilo, he knows there are no tribes that live close to here. Certainly none that... I mean, Nilo wore a Chicago Bulls tank top the entire time he was with me. Most of the indigenous people are wearing short shorts and tank tops and shirts that they buy at the settlements you can reach by canoe. So, I mean, to see a man wearing a loincloth is quite rare in this modern world. Right. And there is no society or cultural group that live in this part of the rainforest. This man is not a guide. He is not a hunter from another village. There is really no rational reason for this man to be dressed as he is, walking where he is. Certainly no explanation for him to levitate.
Yeah, that's the key.
Leave no footprints. Yes.
Like, throwing on a loincloth is anyone's prerogative. It's not common. You're right to say that it's
I'm doing it right now.
Well, yeah, duh. I mean, that's it. We made a pledge. We were all going to pod in loincloth.
That's podcast protocol, yeah.
No, if I don't have leather across my sack, I'm not doing justice to any story. But that having been said, the lighter than water aspect is pretty fucking incredible. Not just incredible, but like you're unable to jibe that with what somebody is capable of doing. I've never seen anyone walk across water, and
it's weird.
It's unnerving, but it's not inherently threatening. What made it threatening for Nilo was the fact that he was entering the heart of the jungle. So he was in a place he knew he shouldn't be, and he saw something that he couldn't make sense of. But as his stories continued into the night, they got more and more spooky, because in each story, he and whatever expedition he is guiding at that point are deeper into the jungle than the previous story. So I'll now move to the next incident, which is a separate expedition entirely. It might have been years later. Again, time moves differently for the Takana. He couldn't tell me when any of these stories happened, only that they happened chronologically. But Nilo and his team had, again, settled on the banks of a river for the evening. But the foreigners were eager to sort of plan out how they would traverse the mountain on the opposite side of the river the following day. So Nilo and his team had gone off to traverse the mountain to plan out the track, leaving the cook that had come with them, who was a Takana woman like Nilo, behind to prepare them an early supper for when they returned. And they were away for about 3 hours, and when they returned, it was early evening. They came back to the campsite to find that the camp was empty, and there was no sign of the cook. And they wondered where she could. I know it's a bad sign, right? And they're in a part of the jungle.
It evokes in me like Theodore Roosevelt's retelling of the trapper that went out to collect his traps, came back, found his partner missing, and it's just like fucking a bloody fucking Sasquatchian mess. Yeah, I coined that phrase, Sasquatchian.
Nice.
Sasquatchian.
But just when you expect somebody to be there preparing you because you're going to be famished after a long day's hike, and they're just not there. That like the Anjakuni mystery, it just creates a sense of unease.
You just get uncomfortable, and I think it adds to the fact that you are in a part of the jungle where no one ever goes. So you're already in the unknown. So for one of your team to be absent is jarring. But they weren't panicking yet, and Nilo and his team, looking for the cook, went down to the river. This is a different river from Nilo's previous story, but a lot of these stories involve rivers because you normally make your campsite on the edges of rivers because it's a source of running water. They went down to the river, and as they reached the beach, they were greeted by a sight of horror. The cook's pots and pans were scattered in disarray, and among it all lay the cook, who was writhing and coughing, her eyes showing only the whites, and she was spluttering froth from her mouth. Her hands were tightly clenched, and her legs were kicking. Nilo ran to her side and urged her to breathe, rolled her onto her side so she wouldn't choke. And he started speaking old words, sacred words he'd hoped to never use. And then he took out some of that awful smelling mix I mentioned earlier and started to apply it to her.
Oh, the stuff that was in the Cayman's tooth, the salsa.
The salsa, the cigarettes, and the coca leaves.
Yes.
And he took some out of his tooth, but also, I mean, she was the cook, so she had some of the yahua, the salsa, on her, and then all Takana have coca leaves, and his companions had cigarettes, and he took a lot from all of them, crushed it all up, and applied it to her head and shoulders.
So not to interrupt you, Nick, but Nilo's instinct right out the gate was not necessarily just something epileptic, but like he was going to mitigate whatever he could that might be of a paranormal origin.
Yes.
I assume by using this concoction. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. He immediately assumed that there was a paranormal cause for this woman's fit and chose to address it thusly. And he applied it to himself after he applied it to her, this mix, as if it were face
sage.
Yes, exactly. His foreign companions did not partake of the foul-smelling unguent, but that's more fool them, really. Her breath now started to slow, and the froth in her mouth became more liquid, but her eyes were still white, and she was still shuddering. So this is when he began to whisper the old words in earnest, and he plugged her nostrils with 2 fingers and held her there for a moment, which seems strange to me, but this is how he described it to me. For a moment, her breathing stopped altogether before she let out a cry, a cough, and then vomited. And then her sense kind of came back to her. Her eyes rolled back, and now conscious, she looked around in a panic, slowly realizing where she was and who she was with, and then began to sob, crying in Takana, but crying, "No more, please, no more, my God, no more."
Oh, God.
And
Jesus.
for about half an hour, she was inconsolable, hysterical, and could only insist that they get away from the river. And once they got her back to the camp, where she calmed down, she started to explain what had happened. And the cook, who Nilo never named, but we'll refer to just as the cook in the story, said she'd been cleaning the pots, getting them ready to make the expedition its meal, when she had felt compelled to look up from her work, which is creepy.
Always.
She had the urge
I always
to just
wonder,
look
like,
up.
when you're compelled to look up, and again, I know I'm fascinated to hear where the story goes, Nick. I apologize for constantly interrupting, but I have to say this: we've all felt compelled to just look up or look to our left or look over our shoulder, and part of me thinks, is this some latent psychic ability we all have, or some interconnectivity, some synaptic thing that again, like we've talked before, higher science that hasn't described yet, or is there something fucking even more mysterious and possibly nefarious going on? Because when you get that feeling and you look and there's nothing there, you're chilled. When you get that feeling and you look and there's something there, you're fucked.
Yeah.
Maybe not fucked like corporeally, but like you get that like gut chill, like, shit. So
There've been times when it's happened to me totally innocuously. I remember I was at my graduation, which was taking place in a building that was multi-story, and I was looking for my family, and then I was compelled to look up, just as they arrived in the top story and made eye contact with me. And they said it was really strange because they had just sat down top story of this open building. And as they sat down, I looked up and immediately made eye contact with them. And it's this weird thing where I just like knew to look up. And this happens throughout our lives, both for nefarious and also for totally benign reasons. We just suddenly
you're right. An
know
innocuous, benign connection with somebody you love. That's happened to me too. I can't even tell. You're absolutely right. The amount of times where I've happened to glance to the left and it's a loved one or a friend that's just entering, say, a concert you went and you had no idea they were going to it at a faraway place, and you're like, no shit. But you're right. You're right. It's not always shady.
But it is spooky when it is shady. So she was compelled to look up from her work, and she saw a man approaching her from the forest further down the beach. Unlike in Nilo's encounter, this individual was on her side of the river, walking up to her along the beach. He was some distance away, but she could see he was a powerfully built indigenous man wearing nothing but a loincloth.
Uncanny.
And at the mention of these physical descriptors, one can only wonder what Nilo thought, his own encounter on the river being so similar. She did not know the jungles like Nilo, and therefore did not find it strange to see a man in a part of the jungle where it was reasonable to assume no one had ever been before. She thought maybe he was a local or a wandering guide, and resumed to cleaning her pots. But she looked up again on a second time and saw he was closer to her now, clearly intent on crossing paths with her. But he was approaching her at a strange angle, so that he only presented to her one side of his body. So he's kind of, I mean, I can't really envisage it, but almost crab walking in a way to only show himself in profile to her as he walks towards her up the beach.
That's genuinely weird.
It's very unsettling.
Bizarre.
She called out a customary greeting to the stranger, and he had responded quite civilly, but his words had been indistinct. It was muffled. It was a murmur in a language she could not tell if it was Spanish, Arcana, English, or something else entirely. And he continued his unhurried, confident approach with his eye, only one eye, not quite meeting hers. I say only one eye because, again, we're going to see half his face.
Right,
so
right.
He has this strange sense of confidence about him, which Nilo had reported in his own encounter as well. This man who seems totally in his element, sort of walking sideways towards people across the beach. And she stopped cleaning now, curious of the stranger, and watched him close the remaining distance. He walked forwards without a sound, was now only a few feet from where she squatted over the pots and pans. She greeted him again, and he responded as ever in his same unhurried manner. But what was so strange was that even now that he was so close to her, his voice still sounded far off, like a distant conversation. He was now only about 8 feet from the cook, Nilo says, and she got to her feet, now feeling quite uneasy about this man who, although was so close to her, his conversation sounded so far away, and she addressed him a third time, now curtly, demanding to know who he was. And I write here, at last, only a few feet away from her, he stopped walking and turned to face her front on. It was then she believed she had surely gone mad, for as he had turned, he did not reveal the other side of his face, but instead vanished completely.
Oh, that's the shit show. That's not, that's... Yeah. So it's side. A boisterous, confident manner, speaking a language ill-known, but apparently in a polite tone. And then when it's fucking face on, it's gone.
Yeah.
That shit is just what you don't need.
She's finally like, look, who are you? And he's been perfectly civil to now, but he now just turns to look at her and is gone. She was not staring into the dark eyes of a mysterious wanderer, but at the river which flowed behind where he had stood. Seized by the horror of what she had witnessed, she had collapsed and gone into shock, and in that state she'd been found by Nilo. Recalling the incident filled her with dread, for there are only a few things in this world which allegedly cannot show you both their sides. And Nilo now looked to me this night that he was telling me the story, and he said, Diablos. Of course, that means demons.
Ah, the devil.
Yep, of course.
There is an odd aspect of Christian demonology, which I've encountered a few times before, that a demon can only ever show you one side of them. And though
I've never heard that before.
Yeah,
until I read your piece, I was like, and now I'm no demonologist. I'm not an expert in the lore, and I fully believe what you're saying. But I was fascinated by that because what this brings to the element, brings to the element, that's such a dumb thing to say. What it brings to the story is the idea that maybe a Roman Catholic or European perspective either infused the indigenous and this woman maybe had no idea about that, but just somehow infected the way a deity behaves, or that there is a uniform, universal way in which diabolical entities can interact with humanity, and it has no cultural bias whatsoever.
Exactly.
It's just what they are, and then that is how they manifest, regardless wherever in the world they happen to be.
Exactly. Maybe the Catholics and the Arcana are both describing the same phenomenon that is infinitely older than either of those cultural groups.
Stop for a second there, Nick. How fascinating is that idea? Just throwing it out there, beyond all the rest of what's going on, what we're talking. Because as I like to call myself, a pop culture folklorist and, a crypto historian, I like studying these stories and finding parallels and disparities. But the idea that there is a universal element that is not about like what the Tucanas experience, deep in the Amazonian jungle, or what the Basque experience in Spain, or you can go on and on to these indigenous peoples that might have limited contact with the outside world. When you find universal elements that apply to distinctly indigenous ideas of the, I call it the occult, but just of the paranormal reality, it is beyond fascinating to me that there is something, like you just said, a deeper prehistoric, older continuity that has no bearing on geography or culture, just is a fact, and it's applied, and I guess I should say it is interpreted by the perspective of whoever is experiencing it, through the eyes of the culture that they have been raised in.
Exactly. It almost makes it cryptozoological, although we can't explain it, but it sort of makes you think that there is a being or beings that exist in our world that numerous different cultures and peoples have encountered, that has a standard set of behaviors we consider inexplicable, like only being able to show you half their side. And yet it has come up time and again. And it's important to stress that while Nilo describes these things as diablos, as devils, as demons, it's really because that's the best word you can use to describe these jungle-dwelling entities. I mean, Nilo was an example of a man who ardently believed in Pachamama and was also aware of Christianity, and definitely brought the verbiage of Christianity into his conversation, because he was speaking Spanish to me after all. But
right.
it need not mean that this devil or this demon, as seen by the cook, is the same as the demons encountered in Catholicism. However, they both seem to have some similar traits, which might suggest both entities are something else.
Or
as you
maybe
said.
Like, yeah, exactly. Like, you're absolutely right. It doesn't mean it's intrinsically diabolical, aka evil, but what it might mean, it is a manifestation of an entity that might not be, strictly speaking, corporeal, but might be very real, and just as indigenous to Earth as we are, and
Exactly.
Venus flytraps and anything else, but that, but maybe is much older, and then when it manifests itself to whatever culture, gets interpreted into the context of said culture, but with universal modes of behavior, because they represent something real and not fictitious or imaginary.
Exactly. Absolutely.
That's fascinating. I mean,
it is.
Just not to go way off the deep end, and I'm fascinated by the story as it is in context, but the idea of the universality of it really just it makes me excited.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's a fascinating and incredibly enjoyable concept to entertain as well, because again, it adds that element of validity to it. It makes it seem real and justifiable by our higher science, as we're now calling it.
Right, absolutely.
Higher
As
science
you've
can
dubbed, and
ultimately
I give Nick full credit for that one. God bless you for it, or LTO. I mean, I'm broad spectrum on that.
Yeah, well,
there you go.
We all love LTO now. He's our new guy.
Yeah,
but,
no,
He's our dude, totally.
I'm just not going to limit myself.
I'll
All
press
options
on.
are on the table.
Never take LTO off the table. I always say that.
That's
Well
right.
said, the new saying.
The new T-shirt. There it is.
that's good.
OutterSpace.com.
It's going to really catch on. Hellospace.com, check it out.
There it is.
So, continuing on, there are two thoughts among the indigenous people of the Madidi as to what forest spirits represent. Some see them as purely malevolent manifestations of the wildest stretches of the jungle, which roam with the sole intent of harrying, traumatizing, and killing humans. Then there are those who see them as guardians and protectors. These creatures exist to warn travelers to stay away from the places which are Pachamamas alone. If needs be, they will kill, but they do not do it out of evilness, but out of a sense of duty to protect the forest that is free from human influence. It's also important to bear in mind that, as we established earlier, if Pachamama is as moody as a human, then these entities, even the protectors, might be inclined to occasionally commit acts of violence simply because they are serving a goddess who she herself is not entirely good or bad, but just a combination.
Right.
And
it could be an arbitrary act of malice that is just either reflecting the deity they represent or their own whims, if indeed they are made after
exactly
the image of Pachamama. But no, so that to me is interesting. So the two camps are like a classic Abrahamic idea of straight diabolical, like only has nefarious intent regardless, and but yet still a more animistic idea of it still being imbued with the more violent nature of survival of the fittest and the brutality that it takes to survive, which is interesting because that goes beyond theology into Darwinism,
Which is the perfect example of Arcana, which is the Arcana combine evolutionary scientific Darwinism with theology into a single entity that they believe in.
Right. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
To me, that to me anthropologically is so fascinating because it's that or a slightly more magnanimous version that is like, yeah, no, we're like the Secret Service of Pachamama. We're going to do what we have to do. If you're fucking up enough, we're going to take you out, but we're not here because we have insidious agendas and or we represent the more brutal side of the natural world.
Yeah, exactly.
It's mind-boggling. It really is, Nick. It really blows my mind thinking about these deeper implications of these ideas that predate civilization as we know it.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how far back these kind of ideas go. Nilo himself believes the latter theory. He thinks that they are, they'll kill if they have to, but they're guardians and protectors. But also he knows, as servants of Pachamama, made in her image, as he is, they can be quite unpredictable, and that is why he likes to acquit and wear this caiman and peccary tusk necklace at all times, and he wore it a lot when we were together as well. And he admits
I prefer that.
Yeah, exactly.
I hope that's the case, but yes.
It's nicer to believe that than just the fact that the jungle has truly evil things in there. And he speaks of examples of, like, there was a man in their village, well, not village, but in their cultural group, in their tribe, who was known to hunt bush pigs for sport at night. And one night he went out and he never came back. And no one ever questioned what could have happened to him. They just knew that Pachamama's ministers had killed him, because that's what happens to people who, like, break that contract with Pachamama. So it was never questioned. He was never... Was he trapped? Was he dying? Was he bitten by a snake or stung by a scorpion? It was never questioned. No. This is Pachamama or her ministers doing their job. You don't upset the balance.
Right.
And it's interesting to speak to a people, I mean, as people of the global north, like you guys and myself, our existence on this planet is more or less assured. We have complete dominion over the world we live in. But if you live in the rainforest as a subsistence hunter-gatherer people, you don't control the world around you. And it controls you, which is why Pachamama is as powerful, I think, as they perceive her to be, and why, if someone violates the contract, because, again, these people who live in a world where their existence is not assured, they live a lot more in symbiosis with nature than we do, because we are arrogant enough to assume we control nature. The Arcana would never believe that, and as such, they believe that there are certain entities out there that keep them in line.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And as far as being kept in line goes, this now brings us to the third of Nilo's anecdotes and the last one.
It is this final encounter that Nilo related to you that in some ways to me is the most powerful, as fascinating as the sideways facing, levitating above water and completely disappearing when you can see the whole of them, at least according to the Cook accounts are. This one to me is not only the most, like I say, cinematic and dynamic, but to me, when it wraps up, and I'm not going to give away how it wraps up to our listeners, it leaves you with those kinds of questions, those great questions that Rod Serling would leave you with in the best of Twilight Zone. And that, is it this that allowed for people to be eyewitnesses to this after the fact, or is it this whole other thing that allowed survivors to occur? You really don't know if you're dealing with something merciful or if there was a great thwarting, and it's terrifying. And I can understand why Nilo cited these three things as just these traumatic events that that made him really reticent to step in Pachamama's her own domain. But without trying to give too much away, Nick, I'd like you to take us into this last account that Nilo gave you, and then we can share it to our listeners.
Brilliant, yeah. So I'll jump right into it. So Nilo and an expedition of explorers were deeper into the jungle than he'd ever been before when they heard voices in the trees. They were in a natural clearing, again, close to a riverbank, and were settling down for the night when the sounds of laughter and conversational chatter came upon their ears, coming out of the surrounding forest. And the foreigners were annoyed with Nilo at first because he had promised them that there were no other humans this deep into the allegedly uncharted Amazon. Yet now there sounded to be a whole tribe of individuals or a party of explorers, all in merry conversation. They could hear the conversation, they could hear the laughter, they just couldn't make out the words. And these explorers had challenged Nilo, saying, "We were told by you there were no other humans here." And Nilo responded by saying, "There aren't any other humans out here."
I have to say it at this point. In a fucking incredibly weird episode we just did called The Charterhouse Entities, there was this guy who in the Velvet Bottoms, somewhere in southwestern England, claimed to have heard these like disembodied voices laughing and shouting like merry conversation, like you said, Nick. And I find it interesting, again, in these disparate continents, in these disparate contexts, that these ostensibly paranormal, for lack of a better explanation, entities manifest in a way that is disembodied and vocal.
It's very strange, actually. And even if you could think about the earlier stories that Nilo has told, I mean, when this indigenous man who walks in water speaks to people, his voice is also disembodied, indistinct, and far away.
Yeah, murmur at a distance. It's fascinating.
It's a strange disconnect, and hearing all this chattering and laughing and not seeing anything, it's very unnerving. So Nilo effectively... His companions said, "We thought there were no other humans here," and Nilo told them in response, "There aren't." And something in his face must have convinced them, because he was able to hurry them all into the tent. The river flowed close by, and between the river and the tent was a gravelly beach and an open space of long grass. Sometimes wind in the grass or rushing water can be mistaken for human voices, but this time it was different. Nilo knew the sounds of the uninhabited stretches of the forest well enough to know that they were not alone in a part of the jungle where they had to be alone. He could hear people moving through the trees. He could hear the undergrowth breaking as these people pushed through. And now he started to hear music jingling out of the trees. The voices began to get louder, but there were still no discernible words in any known language, just music and laughter and chattering alien speech.
So what blows my mind at this part is that when you're thinking to yourself, all right, I'm hearing whispering, I'm hearing footsteps through the bramble, that's all eerie but possibly legitimate. It's the injection of music that really entices me, because it's like, oh, well, it could be jovial. I mean, it could be melancholy. It could be ominous, a lot of things. But that to me is like a whole other element. That's not a hunting party. That's not an exploratory expedition. That's fucking music. That means a whole other thing sociologically, I think.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, at that point, you can't think it's any of the normal explanations to have a person in that part of the jungle. I mean, Nilo describes the music as beautiful singing, accompanying a string instrument, which he says sounded to be a guitar, which again seems so incongruous with that particular time and place. And the sun is already beginning to set when Nilo and his team retreat into the tent to listen to the sounds of the guitar and the singing and the voices. And the sounds were beginning to grow clearer, the speech never easier to comprehend. And he says that this guitar was expertly played, accompanying this chorus of singers. And then the sounds swelled as the musicians stepped from the trees and entered the clearing, somewhere between where Nilo's tent was pitched. But by this point, they'd zipped the tent flap up and zipped up the mosquito net inside the main tent flap, protecting themselves with 4 thin walls against whatever was outside. The sound swelled as the musicians stepped from the trees and entered the clearing, somewhere between Nilo's tent and the river. The other members of the expedition and Nilo could hear feet crunching on the stones and the gravel of the beach, as well as branches snapping and leaves rustling, as a mysterious host began to pass by their tent.
Good Lord. It's a parade. It's a glee club. It's a nightmarish cavalcade of very talented singers and instrumentalists. And now he's got to deal with it as the one man that knows none of that shit should be there at that fucking time.
Just
Mardi
stay in the
Gras
tent.
in the jungle.
All you got to do.
The crazy thing at this point, though, is that scared as they were, Nilo suddenly couldn't suppress his curiosity to know what was outside, and nor could he suppress the rational part of his brain, which said that there was a perfectly prosaic explanation for the revelers passing by. And it may seem strange that as a man as experienced in the ways of the jungle as Nilo, who believes so ardently in its powers, would be so easily overcome with curiosity in the face of what he was hearing outside. But Nilo tells me, when he's talking to me this night, that the music was so beautiful you felt in your heart it could not possibly be bad. Whether he was already under the spell of Pachamama or not, Nilo just had to know what was outside, and he couldn't know that he was being lured into a trap.
And there's the crux. That's how it works out. That's the thing, too, because we've all been taught from word go by both fucking self-help gurus and people we know and trust that are elders, trust your gut. But what we're never told on the side, and I think our ancestors, maybe even our grandparents, certainly our great-grandparents and beyond, were taught that sometimes that gut voice, that instinct that's always supposed to guide you in the right direction, sometimes that's being guided by a nefarious, powerful thing, and you have to ignore that because some shady shit is about to unfold and you're going to expose yourself.
Sometimes something is in your gut that shouldn't be there. Exactly.
There it is. A paranormal parasite, if you will.
A paranormal pancreas.
I don't reject every gut instinct because I know a lot of them are true and good. And I know it comforts a lot of people to always say, hey, trust your gut. If it says turn left and not right, do it. Maybe there's an accident in your future if you don't. I get all that. And if it's a principle that has guided you well thus far, fucking A right, keep up with it. But those of us that maybe overthink things, I am absolutely amongst that group. Sometimes you have to wonder, is that my gut? Or is that some shady shit manifesting itself as my gut? And I can't fucking rely on you. And it seems like Nilo at this point, based on your foreshadowing of lured into a trap, might have been following a gut that was not his own.
Exactly. Something else had come in and replaced his gut with one that might be more susceptible to whatever was being planned outside his tent by whatever entities were playing the music.
Son of a bitch.
Nilo unzipped the inner mosquito net and began to lower the outer tent flap. He'd only moved it down 2 inches when his skin went cold and prickled all over. As the air from beyond the tent began to trickle in through this 2-inch gap, he sensed that something very evil lay right outside. Leaving the tent flap open by 2 inches, he placed his eye to the hole. I don't know if I would, but he placed his eye to the old hole of the tent flap and looked out through the evening gloom down to the river, already sensing, as I mentioned, that there was something very evil outside.
Oh.
The music was continuing to play, but he saw no players. The long grass stretched unbroken down to the river's edge, but as he looked on, he saw the tall blades swish back and forth. There was a pattern to the movement of the grass, not made by wind, but by things unseen pushing their way forwards. It was as if many invisible people were walking in rows across the meadow, parting the grasses ahead of them, walking parallel to the tent.
Jesus Christ. You know what that happens to remind me of? I won't go too deep. Those great old 80s Hong Kong horror movies where the hopping vampires manifested invisibly and you just saw the reeds moving and you knew some insidious shit. I mean, you could go back to Evil Dead 2, but some insidious shit was coming and you're like, I know it's only moving grass, but fuck, I know something bad is on its way.
There's something so scary to that. I think of Jurassic Park 2, The Lost World, when the velociraptors are stalking the hunting party through the long grasses, and you just sort of see the grass parting, and then the men just kind of whip down as they get seized by the raptors. That's what I think of when I'm imagining this grass just parting, and you know there's something there, but you can't see what's there.
The unseen predator.
Exactly. Nilo tells me now, I had a premonition. We had to close the tent right now, and we had to pray. Even as he thought this, the unseen troop turned in unison. The pathways being cleared through the grass suddenly turned to face him, and the bending blades of grass rushed towards him as he felt a sudden cold blast of air howl through the tent flap. Something, maybe many things, were rushing across the grass towards him.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. Nilo felt like he'd been winded, like the air had been pulled from his lungs. He did not cry out, but he zipped the tent flap closed again and gasped for air. Had he been even a moment slower closing the tent, whatever was out there would have entered. He knew it. His fingers still holding the zipper of the tent, a great weight like a curled fist thumped against the canvas. The music had stopped now.
Is this what happened in Dyatlov? Is this what happened to those poor bastards that tore their way out of the tent and froze to death and had their heads bashed in by invisible intruders? Because you don't get the first-hand account.
No, I actually, in the next paragraph, I even mention compelling force because I'm borrowing directly from Soviet terminology of the compelling force.
Yes,
exactly.
Absolutely.
I mean, I've written an entire novel which is heavily based around what happened at Dyatlov. It's a whole other thing. We don't need to get into it. But I've done a lot of research into Dyatlov, and hearing Nilo tell the story, I could only think Dyatlov. So I borrowed the Soviet term. Oh, no, exactly. This is almost like what happened at Dyatlov, but Nilo survives to tell the story. Another unseen compelling force now tore at the tent, and the people inside watched in horror as the tent was battered from outside, the fabric crumpling and curling under the weight of blows. Dents and lines formed in the canopy as if talons slashed at it. But it wasn't a jaguar, Nilo tells me. There were no animals out there, only spirits.
Oh, man.
The attack began in earnest, and unseen forces which left no shadow began to strike their tent in absolute silence. Nilo also adds, preempting any further questions, that he knew it wasn't the wind, because wind has never behaved like this before. Invisible fingers fiddled with the zipper to the tent, which Nilo was holding shut from inside, and hands pawed at the cables outside. Fists continued to fall onto the canopy in the dead silence of the night. Nilo eventually released his hold on the zipper and fell supine and began to pray. He told Pachamama he was sorry to have entered her sacred heart, that this was not his realm, and it was arrogant to have ever assumed it was. Nilo tells me he promised her that he and the thrill-seeking explorers he had brought with him would leave the very next day if she would let them survive the night. Spare us, he tells me he said to her, so that we may learn from our mistakes.
That's so powerful, imploring a deity to be like, all right, I fucked up. I know I fucked up. It's the third time I fucked up. I will never fuck up again.
Yeah.
And I love it. So I'm going to ask a question that goes back a little bit. When he stopped and prayed, when he sensed this thing rushing toward him and he zipped up, was he praying to Pachamama and the old gods, or did he not elaborate, or was it something more in the tune of Roman Catholicism? And the reason I ask this is because it seemed like the act of prayer is what brought the things in the grass that seemed to be moving away directly towards the tent. So what I'm wondering is, if he went Roman Catholic, if it was these older, powerful deities were like, hey, fuck you, this isn't going to help you, or if he was going old school, if it means something else.
So I hadn't thought of that, because he sees the things moving through the grass. He says he has a premonition. He says, I have to close the tent and pray. And thinking that, then they rush the tent. And I'd always interpreted that as him having a premonition that something bad is about to happen. I need to close the tent and pray. But you're suggesting that potentially his inclination to pray is what triggered an older entity to take affront to his assumption.
Exactly.
And then rush the tent. See, he never elaborated. He said he realized he had to pray, and then later on he tells me he sort of in his prayer he apologizes to Pachamama. But the implication to pray to begin with, it was never stated he was praying to Pachamama initially. And again, Christianity isn't invisible for the Arcana people. He is aware of it. So possibly his instinct to pray may have triggered a reaction that made him realize that he had to pray to a very particular set of deities right now, because Christianity wouldn't do the trick.
Right. Huh. It could go either way. I'm just fascinated by the premise that if these things happen to be more powerful than human beings, certainly much more ancient, much more learned, and all these other adjectives, yet they still might be at odds with one another in a sense, that you would dare to invoke, say, a Roman Catholic, saint when you're in the depth of Pachamama's bosom. How dare you? That would be intriguing. Or if he just even just the thought that he was praying to Pachamama and her acolytes, the fact that the act of prayer brings attention to you, so you have to weather the storm all the harder, even if it enables you to survive it. It's still another intriguing way to look at it.
Fascinating. And we kind of get into that in the concluding paragraphs of this part of the story, where as Nilo prayed, the forces which beset the tent lessened in strength. They diminished from thunderous blows to feverish rustlings, and eventually to just rattling, which could have been nothing more than early morning wind. And even the wind stopped in time. Nilo prayed throughout the ordeal, but he is not sure if the end of the attack was brought on by his prayer. He's never said exactly to which deities he was praying to at which times.
Right.
But he's not sure if the attack was brought on, if the end of the attack was brought on by his prayer, or if the entities which attacked his tent had never intended to enter it to begin with, and eventually left of their own volition. Maybe they only wished to terrify the intruders of El Corazon del Bosque into leaving. It was as if the creatures had simply tired and left. At
Something
sunrise,
genuinely... Yeah, sunrise is a good point. But something genuinely benevolent might just... It's like a Scared Straight program. Parents don't send their kids to Scared Straight because they want them to be fucking traumatized for life. Well, yes, in a sense they do. But they do it because they want them to turn over a new leaf that won't lead to a premature death or incarceration or whatever else. Maybe it's the deified version of that.
Well, I think that's what Nilo believes, because Nilo had already said, he believes that the spirits of the inner jungle are not inherently malevolent. They will kill if needs be, but they would much rather warn you. And Nilo had been warned before. Each time he went deeper in, the warnings got worse. This is the third warning, effectively. The most terrifying without actually permanently killing. It is a scaring straight. It's a, look, we're giving you plenty of advance warning to stop coming here. And at sunrise, he and the researchers emerged to find no tracks of any man or beast around their tent, only flattened grass.
Of course.
They struck camp without a word and returned the way they had come. And he has not since gone as deep into the unknown as he did on this particular expedition.
I like Nilo's idea, and at least my interpretation of it, in the sense that I went too far. I got a warning. We went a little further. Someone of my people suffered from it, and I helped her get through it, and I was given another warning. I went even further, and I was fucking terrified, but not physically psychologically harmed to the degree that you're warned. And then I'm going to preempt what what is part of your story. He was like, yeah, no, I don't do that again. I don't go this deep again. Because you say specifically, and I'm going to quote you, Nilo has never again journeyed so deep into the unknown. So it seems as if if it was a warning designed to just scare him straight again, to go back to that analogy, it seemed to have worked.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It seemed to have done the trick, which does not mean Nilo is impervious to the whims of the spiritual world of the jungle, as we'll get to very soon. But at least he has never been exposed to something quite like that again. But now I think we enter the fourth encounter.
Yes, which is something that you directly witnessed, which makes it all the more intriguing. So let's jump right into that.
So when we get to the fourth encounter, it kind of gives it away a little bit in the title. But this is something I encountered the following day. I think it was the following day, maybe a day later. It was after Nilo had told me these stories. And I was actually in the Amazon with another person from La Paz, another foreigner. She was from Germany, and we had traveled into the jungle together. She wasn't a journalist, but we decided to accompany each other. And the next day, she and I and Nilo decided that we'd visit a local spring that was within Nilo's family's property to drink the ever-flowing fresh water, go for a swim, and while we were walking, to see a Mapaho tree as well, because Nilo had told me about these spiritual conduits of Pachamama.
Those epic, beautiful, gigantically trunked, magnificent masterpieces of nature.
Exactly. And he said there was one on the way to the spring, which we were very excited to see. Nilo's family is very lucky in that they do have a freshwater spring on their property. So they never want for running water or safe water. Kind of a miracle.
Yeah, no doubt.
But as we were walking there, we were going to walk past this Mapaho tree, which he and his people every year hold ceremonies under. They wear traditional clothing. They sacrifice animals all below the Mapaho tree in honor of Pachamama, she who controls everything in the rainforest for good or for bad. Best to keep her on your good side because she can do terrible things as well. Inspired by Nilo's story from the night before, I had bought from his mother a necklace of my own, which had peccary tusks. His one had caiman teeth, but my one had pig tusks. So he and I both had our spiked necklaces as we went off on this walk into the bush. But it's important for the story to note that my friend traveling with me, who had not been awake the night before when Nilo told me these stories, had not been inspired and thus did not have her own spiritual ward with her as she walked into the undergrowth with us. And after some hours, we arrived at the Mapaho Tree, the king of the forest, which is, again, this tree on his property is a giant tree. We could never hope to encircle it by three of us holding hands. You'd need countless people to actually encircle this giant tree, which is only a few hundred years old. He says there are some trees that are old enough to be thousands of years old, that have memories of the people that came before the Arcana. There's archaeology throughout the Amazon that indicates to being civilizations that have been completely forgotten after they collapsed and the jungle swallowed their settlements and cities. And even within the lands of the Arcana, you can still find stelae, obelisks emerging from the rivers covered in petroglyphs and carvings. And Nilo explains that while he has no memory of these former people, the Mapaho trees do. So they're an incredibly old and respectable thing. And
excuse me for a second, Nick. Mark?
Yep.
Trees remember, suck it. Just had to throw that in there real quick.
Jesus Christ.
Just in case you didn't know. Just in case you didn't remember their emotional depth and their intellectual reach. There it is. We can continue, Nick. I apologize, but I just wanted to make sure Mark remembered.
We literally got an email as we're recording this about plants that feel, a TED Talk. So
oh my goodness.
That's for you, Rob.
If Ted is talking about it, the ephemeral Ted institutionally.
I love Tedothy.
Yes, of course. Tedothy is the shit. Yeah,
totally.
No, trees feel, plants care, and we can continue. I just needed to digress on that point.
I love it. And if every tree and plant is imbued with the spirit of a earth deity, then they absolutely feel, and sometimes that is not for the betterment of people.
That's facts.
As the story will prove. Though this Mapaho tree is younger than all those others, it is still considered a conduit of incredible spiritual power. Like all other trees of its kind, this tree is sacred and a holy place. The Mapaho radiates Pachamama's presence. It's a font of her power, and from this tree, her spiritual messengers can enter the corporeal world and do her bidding. So even though her followers, her spiritual acolytes have most power in the heart of the rainforest, they can enter the prosaic world by way of these trees, sort of serving as doorways. And as Nilo explained all of this to us with reverence, awe, and fear all mixed into one, and while I tried to find a good angle to photograph a gigantic tree that would never fit into a single camera shot, my friend's eyes rolled white and she dropped to the forest floor, seizing violently and frothing from the mouth.
The fuck?
Jesus.
Oh my God.
And Nilo was on his knees in an instant. He rolled onto his side, he leaned in close, he blew the spit from her mouth and whispered to her the old words, much like he told me he did with his cook in the earlier story. And he held her head and made sure she wouldn't choke on her own tongue. I squatted by her legs and felt very useless because I didn't know quite what to do, but Nilo seemed to know exactly what to do in the situation. And for a very quiet and scary, heart-stopping moment, we tried to sort of bring her back to the world. And then eventually the episode passed as he sort of brushed her hair down and blew spit from her mouth and whispered. Her eyes fluttered back to life, and she opened her eyes and looked around, very frightened to realize she had collapsed. And our expedition ended immediately at that point. We didn't go to the spring on that day. We walked right back to the settlement, and she
understandable.
She hardly ever left the clearing after that, and for good reason. And it's interesting. There are a few final thoughts here. I was later informed that she, by friends of hers in La Paz, that she had not been eating almost any of the food we were served during our time in the jungle, and that combined with the altitude changes may have caused the episode we encountered with her below the Mapaho Tree. And I think that is a plausible, scientific, and rather unfortunate medical explanation for what might have afflicted her. But I also think it was just interesting to note the fact that she had this seizure, I think you can call it that confidently, so similar to that which Nilo's cook had suffered, standing below the Mapaho Tree, which is the font of Pachamama's power in the rainforest. And Nilo and I didn't experience this but it is interesting, neither of us experienced this, and we were both wearing our blessed toothed necklaces. And Nilo has even said he knows from a lot of friends who've gone out walking at night not wearing spiritual wards, they have felt things try to throttle them and choke them and cause them to collapse in the darkness of the jungle.
Man.
While there is I think quite a pragmatic and quite sad scientific explanation for what afflicted my friend that day below the tree, you could tell Nilo was quite confident that it was a different reason for her episode entirely, one that was a lot more based on what he had encountered previously with people who haven't quite yet come to terms with the awe-inspiring power of Pachamama.
That's astonishing.
Jesus, wow.
And I gotta say, it's fascinating to me because I've done a lot of long hikes at night in the woods, especially when I was younger. And there's times where I feel completely at peace, or I felt, I should say, and just comforted. And it wasn't always, dependent upon like the intensity of moonlight or how well I could see. There's times I've been in near pitch blackness and felt good. There's been times when I could see almost everything and felt really uneasy. And I've always chalked it up, and with good reason, and I'm not saying this isn't part of it, to my disposition at the time, where I was at, whether or not I was feeling particularly uneasy for whatever reason. I mean, I fall back on Western culture. I think about things in terms of psychology and it's situational and contextual. But then there's part of me that always felt like there's a gut instinct, like some places I've been, not always in a forest either. It could be sometimes in urban settings where I'm just fucking uneasy. And sometimes it's very, it's applicable to the situation. Sometimes it's not. And it makes me wonder too, again, we were talking about the potential universality of these paranormal entities and or deities that only get filtered through cultural perspectives. If indeed, like, woods in Ithaca, New York, and or, the deepest of Bolivia might have manifestations of earth spirits, of elemental elementals of whatever that can reach out and maybe even attack, or like you say, throttle. Like, I mean, I'm sure, I don't know this woman. I don't know anything about her or how she reacted to her environment in her day-to-day life. If she used to like burn worms with a magnifying glass, I assume she was a perfectly decent human being. But to get, and again, I understand you're not saying this is what happened, but potentially to not be protected by talismans and to have been throttled by perhaps these acolytes to a powerful nature deity, it makes me wonder, like, if we really are exposed to things en masse that we can't interpret through a rational worldview that still affect us, though maybe not as, I wouldn't even say not as profoundly, but we're just not as aware of it as those people that are more in tune with their environment.
Exactly. I mean, it's actually a very interesting point that maybe it was Nikolaus' perspective that made us realize maybe there was something else happening here. Whereas had we been in any other location without the insight of someone who exists in a world where spirituality and science are in perfect harmony, if we'd been anywhere else where someone didn't think like that, we would come up with other explanations. I think it's a very interesting observation you raise, actually. Yeah. It does make you think.
I mean, that's the thing you have to entertain. You have to be open to the idea. I mean, we are all, every intelligent human being is open to the idea there is more than you know. In fact, every good scientist, even if they are steadfast in the dogma of whatever branch they're in, are still open to the idea that there are more things to be discovered within even the limited framework of what they believe in. And I mean that literally as belief and what they know. But they still understand there's more to be discovered. And then people that are more open-minded are like, yeah, there's a fuck ton. But me being just a layman and at very best an amateur speculator, I don't even know how to fucking call it, I'm always like, yeah, every branch of everything I know and love, and I love, I mean, PBS is my jam. I love watching every scientific documentary I can come across pretty much, is wide open to a deeper appreciation and interpretation. And as you said, and as I gave you full credit for, Nick, the higher learning concept, we in the Western world break it down to folklore and fact. And that is so limiting in some ways that it's almost, it's not only egregious, it's fucking sinful.
Yes, it is arrogance in its purest form.
100%. And so I'm really open to the idea that there are deeper levels, and that higher science, when it does come to fruition, will start being able to break it down and put it into groups. And yeah, there'll be dogma then too. And there'll be things that will be limited and people that will be ostracized because they believe them. I mean, nothing happens all at once. But I really feel like we're at a place now where we need to break past the Newtonian Cuvier paradigm and start looking at a broader spectrum way of perceiving the world we live in.
You're absolutely right. We need to realize that we have not solved science. We have made amazing progress with it, but there is so much more that we're yet to understand. And maybe people who have not had the cultural experience of the global north may have an understanding of science that we consider baffling, but one day will exist in complete harmony with. We need to reach that level of enlightenment and continue like that sort of scientific journey. We have not reached our peak. We may never reach our peak. No society has ever reached its peak. We cannot assume we have.
Absolutely not. Not only have we not, but I love what you're saying. It is the eternal struggle to try to get to it. I don't think any society ever will. In fact, if you think you've achieved it, you are fucking deluded by your own hubris, because you have not. But I love the idea of the eternal struggle towards it and never being so sad. Yes, I'm glad we fucking kicked the iron lung and fuck polio and plenty of other progress we have made in medical and other sciences. But that doesn't mean we're there by a shot.
Not at all.
Yeah, I'm not going into the Amazon anytime soon. So,
bring it back down to the basics.
Totally not. Yeah, I am not fucking with anything there. That is like definitely some deep rooted shit that like you don't really want to fuck with. But that's interesting. And well, I mean, I guess if my fear keeps me in check, yeah. But that's that's just crazy. That's
it's totally bucket list for me,
creepy.
but I know where Mark is coming from in the sense that I would never, with the Western arrogance of our predecessors, like just shit on the notions of native peoples, indigenous peoples, because I come from a place that stole gunpowder from China a little earlier than you did. Fuck you.
You gotta tread real lightly with that shit.
Exactly. It's dumb.
Lightly.
It's dumb.
Respect
is key. Exactly.
Respect
what I'm saying.
the local laws, even though if you don't know them. Like exactly.
And be
All
aware
right.
that the world is deeper, weirder, more profound, and again. And again, Nick, I can't give you enough credit for saying it. It is not that it is paranormal or supernatural or preternatural. It is all of those things. It is also undiscovered science. In the end,
totally.
Science will always cover it. And we'll never get to the end of science, but that's part of the beauty of science, that it is ever evolving. We are always opening our mind. We are always expanding our horizons. And we're always looking for an objective truth, even if that is ephemeral and there's always, the goalposts are always moved. That's okay, because getting stuck in dogma and frozen is the death of human capacity and potential. And so as long as we keep trying, then we'll succeed.
Or conversely, maybe science will be done with us. Oh, you didn't see that one coming, did you?
No, you flipped it.
Yeah, like
you're
that.
our own personal Rod Serling. Well played, dude.
You like that? There it is. Boom. Science. When science officially says, "I no longer need you, you sacks of meat." Goodbye. There you go. So, wow, that's man. Jesus,
hail to our robot overlords.
But that's definitely some. That's crazy.
No, Nick, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Jesus.
It's so great, like I say, to go from this very historically archaeological based cryptozoological exploration, which is excellent, to this much more esoteric but just as fascinating exploration of is this Bolivia and South American and Andean and Amazonian cultures. You really have taken us on two trips that I have loved, and I can't wait to see where your next journeys go. You have fans in us, and we're always going to support you. And thank you so much for coming on again to share with us.
It's been an absolute
thanks so
pleasure.
much.
You have fans and me as well for what you guys do. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I cannot wait for another time where we can hang out like this, and I can be your guide on yet another spooky adventure.
With some creepy calzones and some spooky pizzas and some Amazonian goddesses that you don't fuck with, and be super respectful, and you better do shit right, or they are going to give you honestly, after the first one, I think the warning is where you got to just be like, I might not want to go anywhere else. Like, just stay right there.
Sometimes you got to be self-preservatory and pragmatic.
Yeah, man.
But other times you got to throw caution to the wind and say, fuck it, I got to know.
Adventure
I got to know what's there.
Adventure time.
Sometimes just walking past a tree does the trick. So we're never safe. We just have to respect nature and understand that it will always have one up on top of us, and maybe it's alive. Science will tell us one day.
Yeah, totally.
No, trees are smart, and you're talking to a guy that almost walked on the right-hand side of a stupa once and got corrected real quick. So you just never know. You have to be cautious about everything you do. But more than that, you can't live terrified. You just have to enjoy the adventure. And Nick, you've had hellified adventures, and thank you for taking us and our audience on this ride.
Thank you.
Definitely. So, Nick, where can folks find you again on the Instas and the Twitters and the Facebooks?
Right. So, if you want to find me on Instagram, I am Nick Swift Diggs. That is NikswiftDigs. On Twitter, I am at Nick and Daniel. That is NickAndDaniel. I wish I had a more official Twitter account, but I don't. That's the one my friend made for me a decade ago.
Nice.
My TeePublic, where I am selling archaeology, cryptozoology, and paleontology themed T-shirts and general adventurers attire, is Nick Swift Draws. NikswiftDraws. Best to access that through my Instagram, though, because my SEO is not very good, and I can't find myself if I search myself on Google. So that's just a little thing I'm working with. And then on Facebook, I'm Nikolaus Montague Cox. That is Nikolaus Montaguecox. My middle name is not Montague. That's just something I did in high school, which I've never fixed.
Bring it on over to Facebook. Also,
Absolutely.
too, the links for that will be the links for all of Nikolaus's, all of his presence online will be in the description of this podcast, as well as the documents and everything that he's prepared for this. So you can check that out in the attachment on Patreon. So Nikolaus, thank you so very much again. It was awesome talking to you, man.
Thank you.
Definitely we'll figure out when to get you on here for your third appearance, and totally. That's fucking. Well, I guess technically it's a two-parter, so it'll be like your
fourth appearance.
It'll be your fourth. Yeah, there you go. Look at that. Yeah, 4 appearances. Nice.
Wow, I love
Sweet.
it. Thank you guys so
Totally.
much. I have so much fun hanging out with you guys. I'm just hanging out with a bunch of really good friends, and it's such a pleasure to talk to you. So thank you so much. And
totally.
Oh,
awesome.
you're welcome. The conversation's great. It is a joy. I know our listeners are going to like the ride, and thank you so much. I can't wait till the next time. And I hope all you motherfuckers loved it too, because it really is a fascinating trip and a lot of things.
Yeah, no, it is. It's creepy.
It's
creepy.
That
I
really
actually forgot.
Titillate the brain.
Like, I forgot for a minute that I was part of the podcast. I felt like I was listening to a podcast where I was like, I'm like listening and I'm like, oh shit, I'm supposed to interject. I'm like, I can't right yet. I'm too deep. Like, I need to know what's going to happen next. I need to know.
Amazing.
So there you go. So
brilliant.
Thank y'all so very much for joining us, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Talk to you soon.
Goodbye, friends.
See ya.